Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's introduction to the Second World War, this one dealing with North Africa and Sicily. It's the second video on chapter 12, the driving back the Germans. In the war as a whole, the first large-scale retreat of the Germans and their Italian allies was in North Africa, following Montgomery's victory at El Alamein and Eisenhower's landings in Algeria and Morocco, both in November 1942. Before El Alamein, Montgomery had worried about his somewhat untrained troops, and in his later pursuit of the retreating Germans towards Tripoli and Tunisia, he avoided risks, seeking to avoid the renewed blow to British morale caused by any potential German counterattack. Rommel commented on the British caution and inability to make resolute decisions, but the slow pace of the British advance also reflected their need to ensure that they were able to bring up their artillery, the most effective part of their army. Rommel had begun his retreat from Egypt on the 4th of November, and his forces fell back into Tunisia early in February 43. American and British troops had begun their invasion of French North Africa on the 9th of November 1942. Although they were prudent in their tactics, they were bold in their overall strategy, utilizing their superior navies and air forces. The Allied landings in North Africa consisted of three separate forces, the westernmost landing in Morocco on various sites, the central one in the area around Oran, and the eastern one in the area around Algiers. The whole operation was named Torch and included 3 descents on potentially hostile coasts, each achieved after sailing through miles of U-boat infested waters and mostly within range of German air reconnaissance. The vessels of the first waves were loaded for immediate combat. The forces that landed on Morocco's Atlantic coast had sailed directly from the United States, those for Oran and Algiers from Britain. It was a major logistical operation and really one of the most impressive of the entire war. There had been disagreements about the plan, the British wanting to also land at what is modern Annaba, Bonnet, then close by the Tunisian border, so as to forestall the Axis turning Tunisia into a major foci of resistance, easily supplied across the Mediterranean through the ports of Tunis and Bizerta, whilst the Americans had wanted to concentrate on Morocco's Atlantic coast in case the Spanish joined the war and cut off the Allied forces from Spanish Morocco. There were only enough landing craft for 3 landings. The Americans still thought that a landing at Algiers was risky. But what about the French? The French authorities in North Africa obeyed the Vichy government under Pétain, but the Americans thought that they could persuade them not to resist an Allied invasion or only put up a nominal resistance, particularly if they avoided involving de Gaulle's fighting French. Some local French leaders were willing, but others were opposed, and each of the landings was different. The easiest was Algiers, where the Allies landed virtually unopposed. But Oran, the Americans faced strong opposition from the French naval garrisons and batteries, whilst at Casablanca, a willing army chief was arrested by the pro-Vichy resident governor. The key decision was made by Admiral François Darlan, the commander-in-chief of the Vichy military, who was in Algiers at the time. Initially, he had ordered resistance, but when he saw the strength of the Allied forces, he ordered a ceasefire throughout the region, avoiding potential conflict at Casablanca. The main exception was Tunisia, where the French put up no resistance to the Axis, who rapidly transformed the colony into a strongpoint, with airborne German troops arriving on the 9th of November and supply ships from the 12th of November onwards. With strong contingents of German and Italian troops soon joined by the survivors of Rommel's trek from Egypt, the Axis forces assembled 250,000 men, 3/5 of them German. They were able to block the further advance of the Allies, who had more men, 650,000, after they'd been joined by the British Army, 8th Army from Egypt, but whose forces included a lot of American soldiers and officers who were entirely inexperienced, and 2/3 of whom were focused on support rather than combat. This is Tunisia, so you have the situation where the British are advancing from Libya in the east through southern Tunisia, and the joint British and American forces are advancing from the west through Algeria and then into northern Tunisia. The Germans showed their normal tactical skill, whilst the Italian units fought well in the mountainous countryside. The Axis were not able to expand their area of control, but they defeated American attacks and conducted a successful tactical retreat when the British 8th Army advanced from the south. The determining factor was supplies. Initially, the Axis were well supplied from Sicily, with therefore much shorter supply lines than the Allies. But by March and April 1943, the Allies prevented almost half of the needed supplies getting through, and by early May, over 3/4. The Allied intervention became easier as the British were able to read Axis signals traffic, and Allied airfields were established in eastern Algeria and in Tripolitania in western Libya in April. 2/3 of German transport aircraft in the Mediterranean had by then been destroyed, and Axis escort fighters and ships could be attacked. By the 4th of May 1943, the local Axis command no longer had enough fuel, water, food and ammunition to continue, and after firing off their ammunition and putting their equipment out of action, surrendered to the Allies, who thus acquired about 150,000 German and 90,000 Italian POWs, who were now much better off than if they'd been in Russia. Hitler's usual order to fight to the last man were ignored. The battle for Tunisia had lasted 6 months and cost the Allies 11,000 dead and 40,000 wounded, just over half of these British and a quarter each American and French. The battle indicated that German morale and fighting ability remained formidably high. Note that the Anglo-American cooperation under General Eisenhower worked surprisingly well, with tensions between the various services, land, sea and air, at a higher level, more common than national tensions. The Allied seizure of Tunisia had major consequences. First, the southern shore of the Mediterranean area was now all under Allied control. Secondly, some pressure on the Soviets had been relieved by the transfer of a significant number of high-quality German troops and considerable air strength to Africa. And thirdly, the Western Allies got their first taste of a warm welcome by a friendly, liberated population. On the other hand, the sustained Axis resistance meant that the likelihood of an attack by the Western Allies on France in 1943 was further reduced, and the chances of victory by German U-boats in the Atlantic was improved. Now let's turn to Sicily. The British and American political and military leaders agreed at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943 that Sicily should be invaded after the Allied conquest of Tunisia. The invasion of Sicily began on the 10th of July 1943. This was the largest seaborne assault of the whole war, with 180,000 men landed in the first wave from 2,590 ships and landing craft. This was a major logistical operation, with troops coming from North Africa, Egypt, Malta, Britain, and some even directly from the United States, with a brief pause in Iran. The forces were landed in the southern part of the island. Note, by the way, how rugged Sicily's geography is. The invasion involved several problems, including mistakes in landing the Allied glider and parachute troops. They were dropped over a wide area, and some were even dropped into the sea. Many of the Allied aircraft received friendly fire from Allied warships. Some of the airborne troops were attacked by Allied troops who had already established themselves on the island. There were significant tensions caused by British General Montgomery's forceful demands and his disdain for the American troops, who he saw as inexperienced and soft. The overall command in Sicily was under the more tactful Alexander, who was able to smooth away some of the antagonisms between the British and American generals. Lower-ranking officers worked well together. Parker describes Montgomery as a domineering bully. Despite often strong resistance from Italian and German forces in Sicily, the Allies were victorious, and by early August, the German and then the Italian commanders had decided to evacuate the island, the evacuation being completed by the 17th of August in good order, less than 6 weeks after the Allied invasion had begun. So thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel. Please do like, comment and share on the videos if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll talk about the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. Have a good day.